In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a priceless coin collection vanishes from a locked safe, shattering the tranquility of Hawthorne Manor. Was it the grieving owner hiding a desperate secret? The sharp-eyed appraiser with a taste for profit? The nervous guest tangled in a web of debt? Or a shadowy thief slipping through the night? Join Miss Jane Marple, whose gentle demeanor masks a razor-sharp mind as she unravels a tapestry of greed, betrayal, and hidden motives, where every clue leads closer to a truth that could cost more than gold. Chapter 1. The Vanished Treasure. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate shadows across her parlor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a skein of pale blue wool unraveling in her lap as her knitting needles moved with the quiet precision of a metronome. The village was peaceful, its usual hum of gossip subdued, but Miss Marple sensed a tremor in the air, the sort that often preceded a disruption in the orderly lives of her neighbors. She was not surprised, therefore, when Lily, her young maid, burst into the room, her cheeks flushed and her apron slightly askew. "Miss Marple, have you heard?" Lily said, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Mr. Hawthorne's coin collection, gone, stolen right from his safe, they say, and not a trace left behind." She paused, catching her breath. "The butcher's boy told me just now. The whole manor's in an uproar." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch, her mild blue eyes lifting to meet Lily's. "Stolen, you say?" she murmured, her tone gentle, but laced with a curiosity that belied her placid expression. "That is most intriguing. Tell me, Lily, what exactly did the boy say?" Lily, eager to share, recounted the tale as it had reached her through the village's efficient grapevine. Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, a retired banker known for his reserved demeanor and impeccable taste, had discovered the theft that very morning. His collection of rare coins, amassed over decades and rumored to include treasures from ancient Rome to the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, had vanished from a locked safe in his study. The manor, a handsome Georgian pile on the edge of St. Mary Mead, was now crawling with police, and Inspector Craddock himself had been seen striding up the gravel drive, his face set in its customary frown. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning over the details like cards in a game of patience. "A locked safe, you say?" she mused. "And no one saw anything amiss last night?" Lily shook her head, admitting she knew little more, but promising to keep her ears open. Miss Marple smiled faintly, dismissing her with a kind word, and resumed her knitting, though her thoughts were far from the scarf taking shape in her hands. By afternoon, an invitation to tea arrived from Mrs. Evelyn Hawthorne, Reginald's wife, whose composure was legendary, but whose note betrayed a hint of strain. Miss Marple, never one to decline an opportunity to observe, donned her best tweed coat and made her way to the manor. The air was crisp, scented with autumn leaves, and the village seemed to watch her progress, as if sensing her quiet determination to unravel the mystery. The manor's drawing-room was a study in understated elegance, with polished mahogany furniture and a fire crackling in the grate. Mrs. Hawthorne, a tall woman with a practical air, greeted Miss Marple warmly, though her eyes were shadowed with worry. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "Reginald is beside himself. Those coins were his passion, you know, each one a piece of history. And to think someone took them, right under our noses." Miss Marple accepted a cup, her gaze drifting to the other occupants of the room. Mr. Hawthorne stood by the window, his shoulders hunched, staring out at the manicured lawn as if it held answers. His face, usually composed, was etched with a mixture of grief and indignation. Nearby, Mr. Clarence Vane, the coin appraiser who had visited the previous evening, sat with a cup balanced on his knee, his thin fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. His eyes, sharp and assessing, flickered toward Miss Marple, then away. Miss Sylvia Gray, a distant cousin of the Hawthorns and their guest for the week, perched on a sofa, her delicate features taut with unease. She smiled nervously when introduced, but her hands twisted a lace handkerchief, betraying her agitation. Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after, his presence adding a formal weight to the gathering. A man of middle age with a methodical mind, he had a grudging respect for Miss Marple's insights, though he often masked it with professional skepticism. "We're dealing with a peculiar case," he said, addressing the room. "The safe shows no signs of being forced. Either someone knew the combination, or it was left unlocked, a possibility Mr. Hawthorne denies." His eyes rested briefly on each person, as if weighing their guilt. Mr. Hawthorne turned from the window, his voice sharp. "I locked it, Inspector. I always do. I showed the collection to Mr. Vane and Miss Gray last night, just a brief display, and I secured it afterward. I'd stake my life on it." His words carried conviction, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in his voice, the mark of a man shaken by betrayal. Mrs. Hawthorne interjected, her tone firm. "It must have been an outsider, a thief, perhaps, who slipped in during the night. No one in this house would do such a thing." Her eyes darted to Sylvia, then to Vane, as if seeking confirmation of their innocence. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene, but her mind alert. She recalled Lily's mention of a shadow seen near the study window, a detail yet to be shared with the inspector. "Tell me, Mrs. Hawthorne," she said, her voice soft. "Was the house quite secure last night? No windows left open, no doors unlatched?" Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated, then admitted that the study window had been found slightly ajar that morning, though she attributed it to a servant's oversight. The conversation turned to the coins themselves, and Mr. Vane spoke up, his voice crisp with authority. "A remarkable collection," he said. "Gold oré from Nero's reign, a silver penny from Alfred the Great, even a 17th-century guinea in pristine condition. On the black market, such items would fetch a fortune." His words hung in the air, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, noting the gleam in his gaze as he spoke of the market. As the tea dwindled and the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts circling the room like a hawk. The locked safe, the open window, the shadow in the night, each was a thread in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. She glanced at Mr. Hawthorne, his pride wounded, at Mr. Vane, whose expertise made him both valuable and suspect, at Miss Gray, whose nervous demeanor suggested more than simple shock, and at the specter of an unknown thief lurking in the village's whispers. St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, had a way of hiding secrets, and Miss Marple knew that uncovering them would require all her patience and perception. She returned to her cottage as dusk settled, the village bathed in a golden glow. Settling back into her armchair, she picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady rhythm. "A most curious affair," she murmured to herself, her mind already stitching together the first clues in what promised to be a most intricate puzzle. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The morning after the theft at Hawthorne Manor cast a pall over St. Mary Mead, its usual tranquility disturbed by the murmur of scandal that rippled through the village like a stone tossed into a still pond. Miss Jane Marple, having accepted Mrs. Hawthorne's invitation to return to the manor that afternoon, walked briskly along the lane, her sensible shoes crunching against the gravel. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and fading roses, and the sky above was a patchwork of gray clouds, promising rain. Her mind, however, was far from the weather. It was occupied with the puzzle of the missing coin collection, each detail a thread to be carefully unraveled. The manor stood imposing at the end of its drive, its Georgian symmetry softened by ivy that clung to the stonework like an old friend. Miss Marple was shown into the hall by a young footman whose usual cheer was subdued, his eyes darting nervously as he took her coat. Mrs. Hawthorne greeted her with a strained smile, her practical nature battling the strain of the morning's events. "You're so kind to come, Miss Marple," she said, leading the way to the study. "Reginald is with Inspector Craddock now, and I thought, well, you've a way of seeing things, haven't you?" Miss Marple inclined her head, modestly, her mild blue eyes taking in the hall's polished oak and the faint scent of beeswax. "I'm only here to lend an ear, Mrs. Hawthorne," she replied, though her mind was already cataloguing the manor's layout. The study, where the theft had occurred, was at the rear of the house, its windows overlooking a secluded garden bordered by high yew hedges. A perfect spot, she thought, for someone to slip in unnoticed. The study itself was a room of quiet grandeur, its walls lined with oak shelves, heavy with leather-bound volumes, and curios from Mr. Hawthorne's travels. A large mahogany desk dominated one end, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a small bronze statuette of Mercury, the god of commerce, and Miss Marple noted with a private smile, of thieves. Above the fireplace hung a portrait of a stern-faced ancestor, his eyes seeming to follow her as she stepped inside. Behind this portrait, she knew, was the safe, now the center of the village's intrigue. Inspector Craddock stood near the fireplace, his notebook in hand, his brow furrowed as he conversed with Mr. Hawthorne. The banker, still pale from the shock of his loss, was gesturing animatedly, his voice tight with frustration. "I tell you, Inspector, the safe was locked. I checked it myself after our guests left last night. No one could have opened it without the combination, not without blasting it, and you see there's no damage." Craddock nodded, his expression one of practiced patience. "Indeed, Mr. Hawthorne, the safe is intact, which suggests either an inside job or remarkable skill on the part of our thief." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple as she entered, and he gave her a nod, half wary, half respectful. "Miss Marple, good of you to come. Perhaps you'll see something we've missed." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. "I'm sure you have everything in hand, Inspector," she said, though her gaze was already sweeping the room. The safe, now exposed with the portrait swung aside on its hinges, was a modern steel affair, its dial gleaming under the study's chandelier. She noted its sturdy construction, the kind designed to thwart even the most determined burglar. No scratches marred its surface, no dents suggested force. "A very fine safe," she remarked almost to herself. "And you're certain, Mr. Hawthorne, that you locked it last night?" "Certain as I am of my own name," he replied, his voice sharp. I showed the collection to Mr. Vane and Miss Gray after dinner, a brief display, nothing more. They admired the coins, we discussed their history, and then I returned them to the safe. I turned the dial myself, 3 times to the right, as always. His hands clenched, as if grasping for the coins that were no longer there. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the window on the far wall. It was a tall sash window, its frame painted a crisp white, and it stood slightly ajar, admitting a cool breeze that stirred the heavy velvet curtains. She crossed the room, her steps deliberate, and examined the latch. It was a simple brass mechanism, polished to a shine, but her sharp eyes caught a faint irregularity, a tiny nick on the inner edge, barely visible unless one knew to look. "This window," she said, her tone light. "Was it open last night, Mrs. Hawthorne?" Mrs. Hawthorne, who had been hovering near the door, frowned. "I believe so, yes. Lily was airing the room yesterday afternoon, and she must have forgotten to close it properly. But surely no one could have climbed in. The window is 6 feet from the ground, and the garden is enclosed." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured, though her mind was elsewhere. She recalled Lily's mention of a shadow passing the window, a detail the maid had shared with the hesitancy of youth. Stepping to the window, she peered out at the garden below. The flower beds were neatly tended, the gravel path raked smooth, but her eyes narrowed at a patch of earth beneath the window. It was slightly disturbed, as if trodden by careful feet, though the marks were faint, blurred by the morning's dew. She made a mental note to speak with Lily again, for the maid's observations, however timid, often held unexpected value. Turning back to the room, Miss Marple approached the safe, her hands still clasped over her handbag. "May I see inside, Inspector?" she asked, her voice deferential. Craddock raised an eyebrow but stepped aside, allowing her to peer into the empty vault. The interior was lined with green felt, its shelves bare save for a single velvet pouch, now empty, that had once held the coins. She noted the precision of the shelves, each designed to cradle a specific coin, and the faint scent of metal that lingered, a ghost of the treasure that had vanished. "Nothing left," Craddock said, his tone grim. "Not a single coin. Whoever took them knew exactly what they were after." He flipped through his notebook, reading from his notes. The collection included, among others, a Roman aureus from the reign of Trajan, a medieval groat from Edward III, and a rare 1642 Charles I shilling. Mr. Vane's appraisal last week valued it at over £50,000. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "A considerable sum," she said, "and one that would tempt many, I imagine." She glanced at Mr. Hawthorne, whose face darkened at the mention of the coin's value. "Tell me, Mr. Hawthorne, who else knew the combination to the safe?" "No one," he said firmly. "Not even Evelyn. I've kept it private since the safe was installed. I change it monthly, and I write it nowhere. It's in my head." His voice held a note of pride, but Miss Marple detected a flicker of unease, as if he doubted his own vigilance. She turned to Craddock. "And the rest of the house? Any signs of entry elsewhere?" The inspector shook his head, explaining that every door and window had been checked, with only the study's window showing any irregularity. The front and back doors were bolted, the servants' entrance locked, and the staff, Lily, the footman, and a cook, had been in their quarters, none reporting anything unusual. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the previous evening. "You had guests, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her tone conversational. "Mr. Vane and Miss Gray, did they remain in the study long after viewing the coins?" Hawthorne hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Not long. We had drinks here after dinner, and I showed them the collection. Vane's an expert, you know, and Sylvia seemed curious. We talked for perhaps half an hour, then they retired to the drawing room with Evelyn. I stayed to lock the safe and joined them later." "And no one else entered the study?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "Not to my knowledge," he said. "Lily was tidying earlier, but she left before we came in. The servants don't linger here. It's my private space." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained serene. She made a mental note to speak with Lily, whose presence in the study might hold more significance than Hawthorne realized. Stepping away from the safe, she wandered to the desk, her fingers brushing lightly against the bronze Mercury. "A charming piece," she remarked, noting its weight. It was solid, unlikely to be moved easily, yet its position seemed slightly askew, as if nudged by a careless hand. Mrs. Hawthorne, sensing the conversation's intensity, offered to fetch Lily, who was in the kitchen. Miss Marple thanked her and, when the maid appeared, drew her aside near the window. Lily, a slight girl with wide brown eyes, twisted her apron nervously under Miss Marple's gentle scrutiny. "Now, Lily," Miss Marple began, her voice as soothing as a lullaby, "you mentioned a shadow last night, near this very window. Can you tell me more?" Lily bit her lip, her gaze flickering to the floor. "I didn't think it was important, miss," she said. "I was dusting the shelves just before locking up, and I saw something move outside. Like a person, but quick, you know? I thought it was the wind in the hedges, or maybe a cat. I didn't look proper. I was in a hurry to finish." "What time was this, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tone encouraging. "About 9, I think," Lily said. "The house was quiet, and the guests were in the drawing room. I locked the window after, but I might have left it a bit open. I was that flustered." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've done well to remember, Lily. Every little thing helps." She dismissed the girl with a smile, her mind turning over the timeline. 9 o'clock placed the shadow after the coins were shown, but before the household retired. A thief, perhaps, scouting the room, or someone closer, testing the window's vulnerability. Inspector Craddock, who had been listening, jotted a note. "We'll check the garden for footprints," he said, though his tone suggested little hope. "The ground's soft, but the dew may have obscured any tracks." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to the village, where gossip might yield more than footprints. She knew from experience that St. Mary Mead's tongues wagged freely, and a stranger, or a familiar face acting strangely, would not go unnoticed. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple took one last look around the study. The shelves, the desk, the window, the safe. All seemed to hold secrets, waiting to be teased out like knots in her knitting. She noted the portrait's heavy frame, the way it swung smoothly on its hinges, and the faint dust on the shelf nearest the window, undisturbed except for a single smudge, as if a hand had rested there briefly. "A curious business," she said softly, almost to herself, as she followed Mrs. Hawthorne to the door. Outside, the clouds had thickened, and a light drizzle began to fall, pattering against the manor's windows. Miss Marple pulled her scarf tighter, her mind already weaving a pattern from the morning's observations. The locked safe, the open window, the shadow, the smudge. Each was a clue, small but significant, like the stitches in her scarf. She thought of Mr. Vane, with his sharp eyes and intimate knowledge of the coins, of Miss Gray, whose nervous demeanor hinted at hidden worries, and of the phantom thief, whose presence lingered in the village's whispers. Most of all, she thought of Mr. Hawthorne, whose pride in his collection might conceal a deeper motive, or a deeper loss. As she walked back to her cottage, the rain a soft accompaniment to her thoughts, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a mystery taking shape. St. Mary Mead, for all its quiet charm, was a place where human nature revealed itself in subtle ways, and she knew that somewhere, in the interplay of greed, fear, and opportunity, lay the truth about the vanished treasure. Chapter 3. The Suspects Assemble. The drizzle that had begun the previous day had settled into a steady patter by the time Miss Jane Marple returned to Hawthorne Manor the following afternoon, her umbrella bobbing like a black mushroom above her tweed coat. The invitation, extended by Mrs. Hawthorne with a note of quiet urgency, was for an informal tea, but Miss Marple knew such gatherings in St. Mary Mead were rarely without purpose. A theft of this magnitude had stirred the village's curiosity, and the manor, with its air of wounded dignity, was now a stage where motives and secrets might reveal themselves in a glance or a poorly chosen word. She entered the drawing-room with her usual air of mild deference, her sharp eyes missing nothing beneath her benign smile. The room was warm, the fire crackling in the grate, its glow casting flickering shadows across the polished furniture and the delicate china cups arranged on a silver tray. Mrs. Hawthorne, ever the composed hostess, presided over the tea table, her movements precise despite the strain etched around her eyes. Mr. Reginald Hawthorne stood near the mantel, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of controlled agitation. Miss Sylvia Gray, the distant cousin, sat on a brocade sofa, her delicate hands folded in her lap, though her fingers twitched occasionally, betraying a nervous energy. Mr. Clarence Vane, the coin appraiser, occupied an armchair, his lean frame angled forward, as if poised to dissect the conversation itself. The fourth suspect, the thief, remained a shadow, an unseen presence that hung over the gathering like the rain outside. Miss Marple settled into a chair near the window, her knitting bag at her side, though she made no move to open it. Instead, she accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Hawthorne, murmuring her thanks, and let her gaze drift over the assembled company. "Such a dreadful business," she said, her voice soft but carrying. "It's hard to believe anyone could be so bold here in St. Mary Mead." Her words were an invitation, gentle as a breeze, for the others to speak and reveal. Mrs. Hawthorne seized the opening, her tone firm but laced with indignation. "It's an outrage, Miss Marple. Those coins were Reginald's pride, his life's work. To think someone crept into our home, our sanctuary, and took them. It's unthinkable." She glanced at her husband, seeking his agreement, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the fire. Mr. Hawthorne stirred at last, his voice low but taut. "It's not just the value, though that's considerable. Each coin was a story, a piece of history I held in trust. To lose them like this—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. Miss Marple noted the genuine grief in his tone, but also the way his hands flexed, as if grappling with an invisible foe. Was it loss, she wondered, or something deeper? Guilt, perhaps, or fear of exposure? Mr. Vane cleared his throat, his sharp eyes darting to Miss Marple before settling on his teacup. "A tragedy, indeed," he said, his voice smooth but precise, like a man accustomed to measuring his words. The collection was unparalleled. I told Reginald only last week that it rivaled some of the finest private holdings in England. The black market, I'm afraid, would see it as a prize worth any risk. His fingers, long and thin, rubbed together briefly, a gesture Miss Marple had noticed the previous day, as if he were appraising the very air. Miss Sylvia Grey, who had been silent, gave a small, nervous laugh that broke the tension like a snapped thread. "It's all so dreadful," she said, her voice high and brittle. "I can't imagine who would do such a thing. Surely it was some criminal, someone from outside the village?" Her eyes, wide and pleading, sought Mrs. Hawthorne's, but Miss Marple caught the quick glance she cast toward Mr. Vane, fleeting as a moth's wing. "An outsider, most likely," Mrs. Hawthorne agreed, her tone resolute. "We've always been careful, haven't we, Reginald? No one in our circle would stoop to theft." Her words were a defense, not just of her household, but of the social order she cherished. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, thought of how often betrayal wore a familiar face, a lesson learned from years of observing the quiet dramas of village life. Inspector Craddock, who had joined the gathering at Mrs. Hawthorne's insistence, stood near the door, his notebook tucked under his arm. He had been listening, his expression one of professional detachment, but Miss Marple knew he missed little. "We're exploring all possibilities," he said, his voice measured. "The lack of forced entry suggests either knowledge of the safe's combination or access to the study when it was unlocked. We're also looking into reports of a stranger in the village, a man seen near the pub the night of the theft." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her face remained serene. "A stranger, Inspector?" she asked, her tone one of polite curiosity. "How interesting. Did anyone describe him?" Craddock hesitated, as if weighing how much to share in such company. "Vague reports, I'm afraid. A man in a dark coat, seen near the manor's gates around 10 o'clock. The groundskeeper, Mr. Potts, mentioned it, but he couldn't be sure of the time or the man's features. We're checking with the pub to see if anyone recalls a visitor." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. A stranger was convenient, a scapegoat for the village's unease, but she knew from experience that truth often lay closer to home. She turned her attention to Sylvia, whose fingers were now twisting the edge of her sleeve. "You must have been quite shaken, Miss Grey," she said gently. "To be a guest in a house where such a thing occurs, it's most unsettling." Sylvia's smile was strained, her cheeks flushing faintly. "Oh, it was awful," she said. "I couldn't sleep a wink after hearing about it. I was in my room all evening, reading, and I didn't hear a thing. It's so frightening to think someone was creeping about." Her words tumbled out too quick, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided the group, settling instead on the rain-streaked window. "And you, Mr. Vane?" Miss Marple continued, her voice as soft as the patter of rain. "You saw the coins that evening, I believe. Did anything strike you as unusual? The study, perhaps, or the behavior of those present?" Vane's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile was polite. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he said. "Reginald showed us the collection, magnificent as always. We discussed their provenance, their rarity. Sylvia was quite taken with a Roman denarius, weren't you?" He glanced at her, his tone light but probing. Sylvia nodded, a touch too eagerly. "Yes, it was fascinating. I don't know much about coins, but they were beautiful." Her voice faltered, and she reached for her teacup, her hand trembling slightly. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the pair, her mind turning over their interaction. Vane's question had been casual, yet it carried an edge, as if testing Sylvia's response. And Sylvia's nervousness, so apparent in her fidgeting hands and darting eyes, suggested more than simple shock. Miss Marple thought of the muddy shoes she had noticed in the hall the previous day, tucked beneath Sylvia's coat. A walk in the garden, perhaps, but at what hour and for what purpose? The conversation drifted to village matters, as it often did in such gatherings, but Miss Marple remained alert, her ears attuned to every nuance. Mrs. Hawthorne spoke of the Women's Institute, her voice a determined effort to restore normalcy. Mr. Hawthorne, however, was less forthcoming, answering questions with curt nods, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. When Miss Marple mentioned the black market again, almost as an afterthought, she watched Vane closely. His hand paused mid-gesture, his eyes flicking to hers before he resumed his easy demeanor. "A nasty business, that," he said, "but not uncommon with items of such value." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of innocent agreement, but her mind was busy. Vane's knowledge of the coins was unmatched, save perhaps by Hawthorne himself. His mention of the black market, twice now, was too specific to be idle chatter. She recalled the postmistress's remark about his parcel to London, a detail yet to be explored but heavy with possibility. As for Sylvia, her unease seemed less about the theft itself and more about her own role in the evening's events. And the stranger, Miss Marple, was not convinced he existed, though the village's whispers gave him shape. As the tea drew to a close, Miss Marple rose, thanking Mrs. Hawthorne with her usual courtesy. "You've been most kind," she said, "and I do hope the inspector finds those coins soon. They're too precious to be lost forever." Her words were sincere, but her eyes lingered on each suspect, as if memorizing their faces for a pattern yet to emerge. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist, and Miss Marple opened her umbrella, her thoughts as intricate as the lacework in her cottage. The drawing-room had been a stage, each player revealing a little of themselves: Hawthorne's grief, Vane's calculation, Sylvia's fear, and the shadow of a thief who might be real or imagined. She thought of her own village, where secrets were buried beneath politeness, waiting for a keen eye to unearth them. As she walked home, the click of her heels on the wet pavement kept time with her thoughts, each step bringing her closer to the truth she knew lay hidden in the quiet of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 4. The Appraiser's Tale. The rain had ceased by the following morning, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in a tentative sunlight that glistened on the wet cobblestones and sparkled in the dew-laden hedges. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, sat in her cottage parlor, her knitting needles idle for once, as she sipped a cup of tea and pondered the theft at Hawthorne Manor. The village was abuzz with theories, each more fanciful than the last, but Miss Marple preferred facts to speculation. Her thoughts kept returning to Mr. Clarence Vane, the coin appraiser, whose sharp eyes and guarded manner had caught her attention during yesterday's tea. His knowledge of the stolen coins was intimate, his references to the black market too pointed to be dismissed as casual. She resolved to learn more about him, and, as if in answer to her musings, an opportunity presented itself when Mrs. Hawthorne telephoned to invite her to the manor once more, this time to discuss a charity bazaar. Miss Marple, sensing a chance to observe, accepted with her usual graciousness. The manor's drawing-room was quieter today, the air heavy with the aftermath of the theft. Mrs. Hawthorne, ever determined to maintain appearances, was arranging flowers in a crystal vase, her movements brisk but her face drawn. Mr. Hawthorne was absent, attending to business in the village, but Mr. Vane was present, standing by a bookshelf, leafing through a volume on numismatics with an air of studied nonchalance. Miss Sylvia Gray was there too, seated near the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the flickering flames. Inspector Craddock had promised to stop by later, and Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her knitting bag, felt the room hum with unspoken tensions. "Such a lovely day after all that rain," Miss Marple remarked, her voice light as she accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Hawthorne. "It does lift the spirits, doesn't it?" Her comment was met with polite murmurs, but she noted the way Vane's fingers tightened on the book, the way Sylvia's shoulders stiffened. The theft, it seemed, had cast a shadow no sunlight could dispel. The conversation turned to the bazaar, but Miss Marple steered it gently toward the coins, her tone one of innocent curiosity. "Mr. Vane," she said, her needles clicking softly as she began a new row, "you must have been thrilled to see Mr. Hawthorne's collection up close. Such rare pieces, I understand. Tell me, what makes them so special?" Vane closed the book with a soft thud, his smile polite but guarded. "They're extraordinary," he said, his voice carrying the cadence of an expert warming to his subject. "Each coin is a relic of its time, Miss Marple. Take the Roman denarii, minted under Trajan. They bear his profile, struck in silver so pure it gleams even now. Then there's the medieval groat, a fourpence from Edward III's reign, its edges clipped from centuries of use. And the Charles Von shilling. Oh, that's a gem, struck during the Civil War, its mint mark a tiny castle, almost worn smooth." His eyes lit with a fervor that bordered on reverence, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something else. Calculation, perhaps, or unease. "How fascinating," she said, her tone encouraging. "And you handled them during your appraisal, I presume? It must be quite a responsibility, assessing such treasures." Vane nodded, his hands rubbing together in that habitual gesture she had noted before. "Indeed, I spent hours cataloging them last week, at Reginald's request. He wanted a precise valuation for insurance purposes. I wore gloves, of course, to protect the coins. Some are so delicate the oils from one's skin could tarnish them." He paused, his eyes meeting hers briefly, as if gauging her interest. "It's meticulous work, but I find it rewarding." Miss Marple smiled, her needles pausing. "I'm sure you do, and such knowledge must make you aware of less savory markets, I suppose, places where such coins might be sought after." Her question was delicate, almost apologetic, but she watched him closely. Vane's smile tightened, though his tone remained smooth. "The black market, you mean? Oh yes, it's a sad reality. Rare coins are prized by collectors who don't ask questions about provenance. A collection like Reginald's could fetch a fortune in such circles, though it pains me to think of it." His fingers twitched, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor, as if his words had stirred something he preferred to keep buried. Sylvia, who had been silent, stirred suddenly, her voice high. "It's dreadful to think of those beautiful coins in such hands," she said, her eyes darting to Vane before returning to the fire. "They belong in a museum, or at least with someone who cherishes them, like Cousin Reginald." Her words were earnest, but Miss Marple detected a note of strain, as if she were speaking to convince herself as much as the room. Mrs. Hawthorne, arranging a spray of chrysanthemums, nodded vigorously. "Exactly, Sylvia. It's a violation. That's what it is. Reginald would never part with those coins willingly." She glanced at Miss Marple, her expression softening. "You've a way of getting to the heart of things, Miss Marple. Have you any thoughts on who might have done this?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained serene. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who listens, Mrs. Hawthorne. But I do find it curious that the safe was untouched, yet the coins vanished. It suggests a certain familiarity, don't you think?" Her words hung in the air, and she noted the quick glance Vane exchanged with Sylvia, so brief it might have been missed by a less observant eye. Before anyone could respond, Inspector Craddock arrived, his coat damp from the lingering mist outside. He greeted the group with a nod, his expression one of determined focus. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, then turned to Vane. "I'd like a word, if you don't mind. We've some questions about your appraisal." Vane's eyebrows lifted, but he rose smoothly, following Craddock to a corner of the room. Miss Marple, pretending to focus on her knitting, listened intently. Craddock's voice was low but clear. "You valued the collection at £50,000, Mr. Vane. Can you confirm the exact items you examined? And did you notice anything unusual about the safe or the study during your visit?" Vane's reply was measured. "The valuation was thorough, Inspector. I catalogued every coin, 27 in total, each with its own history. The safe was secure when I saw it, and the study was as you'd expect, orderly and private. I noticed nothing out of the ordinary." His tone was confident, but Miss Marple caught the slight hesitation before he spoke of the safe, as if choosing his words with care. Craddock pressed further. "And you left the manor when, exactly?" "About 10, I believe," Vane said. "After drinks in the drawing room. Sylvia and I chatted with Evelyn, Mrs. Hawthorne, before I took my leave. I walked back to the village inn, where I'm staying." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, her mind noting the timeline. 10 o'clock aligned with the groundskeeper's sighting of a stranger near the manor's gates, but Vane's departure suggested he was accounted for, or so he claimed. She glanced at Sylvia, whose face had paled slightly at Vane's mention of their conversation. Was it fear, Miss Marple wondered, or guilt? As Craddock continued his questions, Miss Marple excused herself, citing a need to stretch her legs. She wandered into the hall where the footman was polishing a silver candelabra. "Good morning, James," she said, her voice warm. "You must be busy with all this commotion. Were you here the night of the theft?" James, a lanky youth with a shy smile, nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I was in the kitchen, helping cook till about 9. Then I locked up the front and back doors, like always. Didn't see nothing odd, though Lily was fussing about the study window." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Lily's a careful girl, isn't she? Did she mention anything else about that evening?" James hesitated, then lowered his voice. "She said she saw someone outside, ma'am, but she wasn't sure. Thought it might be a shadow. She was in a state, though, rushing to finish her chores." Thanking him, Miss Marple made her way to the village post office, a short walk from the manor. Mrs. Clegg, the postmistress, was a font of local knowledge, her sharp eyes missing little. "Good day, Mrs. Clegg," Miss Marple said, purchasing a stamp she didn't need. "I hear Mr. Vane's been keeping you busy with parcels." Mrs. Clegg's eyebrows rose, her voice dropping conspiratorially. Oh, yes, Miss Marple. He sent a parcel to London the day after the theft, heavy as you like. Said it was books, but it felt odd. Too solid for books, if you ask me. He was in a right hurry, paid extra to have it sent quick. She leaned closer. Mind you, he sent parcels before, but never so urgent. Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. A parcel to London, sent the day after the theft, was a thread worth pulling. She thanked Mrs. Clegg and returned to her cottage, the sunlight now fading into a soft gray dusk. Settling into her armchair, she picked up her knitting, her needles moving. As her thoughts wove a pattern, Vane's expertise, his parcel, his guarded demeanor, all pointed to a man with more than a professional interest in the coins. Sylvia's nervousness suggested a connection, perhaps unwilling, to his actions. And the stranger, if he existed, might be a distraction or a key. As the village settled into evening, Miss Marple's mind was far from still. The appraiser's tale, she knew, was only half told, and in its unwritten chapters lay the truth about the vanished coins. Chapter 5. The Guest's Secret. The soft glow of morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting intricate patterns across her parlor floor. She sat in her armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, her knitting needles lying idle as her mind turned over the threads of the Hawthorne theft. The village of St. Mary Mead was quieter today, the initial fervor of gossip settling into a murmur of speculation, but Miss Marple knew that beneath this calm lay secrets waiting to be teased out. Her thoughts lingered on Miss Sylvia Grey, the nervous young cousin whose delicate features and quick glances had betrayed more than simple distress at the theft. There was something in Sylvia's manner, a flicker of fear, perhaps, or a burden unspoken, that piqued Miss Marple's curiosity. An opportunity to probe further presented itself when Mrs. Hawthorne sent a note inviting Miss Marple to the manor for luncheon. "Reginald is still so shaken," the note read, "and I thought your presence might soothe him." Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of such invitations, suspected Mrs. Hawthorne hoped for more than soothing words. She donned her best woolen shawl, its muted green a nod to the autumn chill, and set out for the manor, her umbrella tucked under her arm against the threat of lingering clouds. The manor's dining room was a study in understated elegance, its long oak table set with gleaming silver and delicate china. Mrs. Hawthorne presided with her usual composure, though her eyes betrayed a weariness that spoke of sleepless nights. Mr. Hawthorne sat at the head, his face drawn, his fork moving mechanically as he picked at his meal. Sylvia Grey was present, her pale hands folded in her lap, her smile brittle as she murmured thanks for the soup. Mr. Vane, the appraiser, had declined the invitation, citing a prior engagement in the village, a fact Miss Marple noted with interest. Inspector Craddock was expected later, his investigation ongoing but, as yet, yielding little. Miss Marple, seated beside Sylvia, observed the young woman closely. Sylvia's movements were precise but restless, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap as if it were a lifeline. Her conversation was polite but strained, her laughter too quick, like a bell rung out of tune. "You must find St. Mary Mead a change from London, Miss Grey," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as she sipped her soup. "Do you visit often?" Sylvia's eyes flicked up, then away, settling on the window where the garden lay shrouded in mist. "Not often," she said, her voice soft but tight. "Cousin Reginald and Evelyn are kind to have me, but I needed a rest, you see. London can be so tiring." Her words were innocuous, but Miss Marple caught the hesitation, the way her gaze lingered on the garden, as if it held answers or threats. "How true," Miss Marple agreed, her tone warm. "The country air does wonders, though I imagine it's hard to relax with such a dreadful event hanging over the house." She paused, her eyes kind but searching. "You were here the night of the theft, I believe. It must have been unsettling, knowing someone was prowling about." Sylvia's spoon paused mid-air, a faint tremor betraying her. "Oh, it was," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I was in my room, reading, and I didn't hear a thing. Not a sound. I only learned of it the next morning, when Evelyn told me." She set her spoon down, her hand retreating to the napkin, which she twisted more tightly. Miss Marple noted the repetition of her alibi, as if rehearsed, and the way her eyes avoided the table, darting instead to the door. Mrs. Hawthorne, sensing the tension, interjected with a brisk smile. "Sylvia's been a great comfort, Miss Marple. She's kept me company while Reginald deals with the police. Haven't you, dear?" Sylvia nodded, her smile forced, and Miss Marple wondered what comfort a nervous guest could truly offer in such a crisis. Mr. Hawthorne, who had been silent, spoke at last, his voice heavy. "I can't understand it, Miss Marple. The safe was locked, the house secure. How could someone walk in and take them? It's as if they knew exactly where to look." His hands clenched around his knife, and Miss Marple saw the strain in his knuckles, the mark of a man wrestling with more than loss. "Indeed," she said softly, her mind returning to the muddy shoes she had noticed in the hall 2 days prior, tucked beneath Sylvia's coat. They had been caked with earth, the kind found in the manor's garden, where the study window overlooked a secluded path. "The garden is lovely this time of year," she remarked, her tone casual. "Do you enjoy walking there, Miss Gray? I find an evening stroll so refreshing." Sylvia's face paled, her fingers freezing on the napkin. Yes, sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The air is nice, isn't it? But I haven't been out much, not with all this rain." Her eyes met Miss Marple's for a fleeting moment, then dropped, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for the girl, whose fear was almost palpable. The luncheon continued, the conversation turning to safer topics, the church fete, the weather, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. Sylvia's unease, her insistence on being in her room, her muddy shoes, all suggested a secret, one she was desperate to keep. Miss Marple recalled Lily's account of the shadow by the study window, seen around 9 o'clock, and wondered if Sylvia's evening walk had coincided with that moment. Was she merely a restless guest, or had she played a role, however unwilling, in the theft? After the meal, Miss Marple excused herself to the hall, where she found Lily polishing the banister. The maid, ever eager to please, paused at Miss Marple's approach. "Lily, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice low, "you've been so helpful about that night. Tell me, did you see Miss Gray at all after you tidied the study? Perhaps in the hall or near the garden?" Lily frowned, her brow creasing. "I don't think so, miss. She was with Mrs. Hawthorne in the drawing room when I finished, but I didn't see her after that. Mind you, I was in the kitchen with Cook, so I might have missed her." She hesitated, then added, "Her coat was in the hall, though, when I locked up. It was damp, like she'd been out." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Damp, you say? How observant you are, Lily." She patted the girl's arm, her mind filing away the detail. A damp coat, muddy shoes, a nervous demeanor. Sylvia's actions painted a picture, one Miss Marple was not yet ready to frame, but which was taking shape with each new stroke. As she prepared to leave, Inspector Craddock arrived, his face set in its usual frown. He drew Miss Marple aside, his voice low. "We've checked the garden, as you suggested," he said. "No clear footprints, but the earth under the study window was disturbed, just as you thought. And we've had word from the pub. Tom, the barman, recalls a man in a dark coat, a stranger, who asked about the manor that night, paid in cash and left before dawn." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "A stranger is always convenient, isn't he, Inspector? But I wonder if our answers lie closer to home." She glanced toward the dining room, where Sylvia was helping Mrs. Hawthorne clear the table, her movements quick and furtive. "Miss Gray seems troubled, don't you think? A young woman like that, so far from home, might have reasons for her nerves." Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "I've noticed. She's sticking to her story, reading in her room, but she's jumpy as a cat. I'll have a word with her later." He paused, then added, "You've a knack for this, Miss Marple. Anything else I should know?" She smiled, her hands folding over her handbag. "Only that people are rarely as simple as they seem, Inspector. But I'm sure you'll find that out." She left him with a nod, stepping out into the crisp air, her mind buzzing with possibilities. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, but her thoughts elsewhere. Sylvia Gray's secret, whatever it was tied to the theft. She was certain of it. The muddy shoes, the damp coat, the shadow by the window, all pointed to a moment of indiscretion, perhaps coerced or regretted. And yet, Sylvia's fear suggested she was not the mastermind, but a pawn, caught in a game she barely understood. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, each stitch a step closer to unraveling the truth hidden in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 6. The Owner's Burden. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, its golden rays filtering through the bare branches of the elms that lined the lane to Miss Jane Marple's cottage. She sat by her parlor window, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm as she reflected on the theft at Hawthorne Manor. The village had settled into a hushed expectancy, its residents awaiting news of the stolen coins with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Miss Marple, however, was not content to wait. Her thoughts had turned to Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, the bereaved owner, whose grief over his lost collection seemed to mask a deeper turmoil. His insistence on the safe's security, his strained demeanor, and his wife's fleeting mention of a mysterious London meeting all suggested a burden beyond the theft itself. An opportunity to probe further arose when Miss Marple received a message from Inspector Craddock, requesting her presence at the manor to discuss new findings. She donned her coat, its tweed warmed by the sun, and made her way to the manor, her steps measured but purposeful. The air was crisp, scented with wood smoke, and the village seemed to watch her progress, as if sensing her quiet determination to unravel its latest mystery. The manor's library, where Craddock had asked to meet, was a somber room, its high ceilings and dark paneling lending it an air of solemnity. Bookshelves stretched to the rafters, filled with volumes on history, finance, and numismatics, a testament to Hawthorne's scholarly passions. A fire burned low in the grate, casting a faint glow over the leather armchairs where Mr. Hawthorne sat, his posture rigid, his hands clasped tightly on his knees. Mrs. Hawthorne stood by a window, her silhouette sharp against the fading light, while Craddock paced slowly, his notebook in hand. Miss Sylvia Gray and Mr. Vane were absent, a fact Miss Marple noted with interest, as it allowed her to focus on the man at the heart of the crime. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming," Craddock said, his voice brisk but tinged with the respect he reserved for her insights. "We've had a development, and I thought your perspective might be useful." He gestured to Hawthorne, whose face was pale, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Mr. Hawthorne has been kind enough to share some financial details that may be relevant." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, though she made no move to open it. "I'm happy to listen, Inspector," she said, her tone gentle but alert. Her eyes rested on Hawthorne, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped each other as if to steady himself. "It must be a great strain, Mr. Hawthorne, to lose something so precious. I do hope we can shed light on this matter." Hawthorne's lips tightened, and he nodded curtly. "It's more than a loss, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low but edged with bitterness. "Those coins were my legacy, gathered over 30 years. To have them stolen from my own home, it's a violation I can't fathom." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor, and Miss Marple sensed a weight in his words, as if the theft had exposed a vulnerability he preferred to keep hidden. Craddock cleared his throat, flipping open his notebook. "We've been looking into Mr. Hawthorne's affairs, as is standard in cases involving valuable assets. It seems, sir, that your finances have been under some strain recently. You've sold off several properties in the past year, and there are rumors of debts. Could the theft be related to this? Perhaps an attempt to claim insurance?" Hawthorne's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with indignation. "Are you suggesting I stole my own collection?" he demanded, his voice rising. "That's absurd. I'd sooner sell the manor than part with those coins. They were irreplaceable, Inspector, worth more to me than money." His hands trembled, and Miss Marple noted the raw emotion in his tone, though she wondered if it masked a deeper truth. Mrs. Hawthorne moved from the window, her voice calm but firm. "Reginald is right, Inspector. The coins were his passion, not a financial asset to be cashed in. We've had challenges, yes, but nothing that would drive us to such a scheme." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, seeking support, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her mind busy with the implications of Hawthorne's financial strain. "Forgive me, Mr. Hawthorne," Miss Marple said softly, her voice cutting through the tension like a breeze. "I don't doubt your attachment to the coins, but I wonder, had you considered selling them recently, perhaps to ease these pressures? It's only natural when times are difficult." Hawthorne's face softened slightly, though his eyes remained guarded. "I thought about it," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "A dealer in London approached me a month ago, offering a substantial sum, but I refused. I couldn't bear to part with them, not even for solvency." He hesitated, then added, "I met with him last week, just to discuss, but I made it clear the coins weren't for sale." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, her needles still in her lap. "A dealer, you say? How interesting. And who was this gentleman?" Her tone was conversational, but her eyes were sharp, noting the way Hawthorne's fingers tightened at the question. "Felix Drayton," he said reluctantly. "A reputable man, or so I thought. He specializes in rare coins and antiquities. I met him at his office in Mayfair, but I assure you, Miss Marple, I left with no intention of selling." Craddock jotted down the name, his expression one of keen interest. "Drayton, you say? We'll look into him. Did he know the details of your collection? Its location, perhaps, or the safe's security?" Hawthorne frowned, his brow creasing. "I showed him my catalog, a list of the coins, their descriptions. He was very interested, asked about their storage, but I was vague. I said only that they were secure." He paused, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "You don't think he—" "We'll check," Craddock said, his tone brisk. "Anyone with knowledge of the collection is a person of interest." He turned to Miss Marple, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Any thoughts, Miss Marple? You've a way of seeing connections we might overlook." She smiled, her hands folding over her knitting bag. "Only that secrets have a way of slipping out, Inspector, even when we think we're careful. Mr. Hawthorne's meeting in London is a thread worth following, don't you think?" Her words were gentle, but her mind was racing, connecting Drayton's name to the parcel Mr. Vane had sent to London, a detail she had yet to share with Craddock. Mrs. Hawthorne, sensing the conversation's weight, offered to fetch tea, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to step into the hall, where she found the footman, James, polishing a brass doorknob. "Good afternoon, James," she said, her voice warm. "You've been so busy with all this fuss. Tell me, has Mr. Hawthorne been himself lately? I imagine the theft has been a great shock." James nodded, his young face earnest. "He's been proper upset, ma'am, not sleeping, pacing the study at all hours. Even before the theft, he was different, snappy, and always checking the safe. I heard him talking to Mrs. Hawthorne about money, saying they'd sort it out soon." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained kind. "How observant you are, James. And did he mention this London trip to anyone here? Perhaps to Miss Grey or Mr. Vane?" James shook his head. "Not that I heard, ma'am, but Miss Grey asked me about trains to London the other day. Said she might need to go back soon. Thought it was odd, her being so jumpy." Thanking him, Miss Marple returned to the library, her thoughts weaving a tighter pattern. Hawthorne's financial strain, his meeting with Drayton, his obsessive checking of the safe, all pointed to a man under pressure, perhaps vulnerable to manipulation. The mention of Drayton, a name now linked to Vane's parcel, suggested a connection that could not be ignored. And Sylvia's inquiry about trains hinted at a desire to flee, or to follow someone else's lead. As Craddock prepared to leave, he drew Miss Marple aside, his voice low. "We're digging into Drayton's background," he said. "He's got a reputation, not all of it clean. If he knew about the coins, he might have passed the word to someone less scrupulous." He paused, then added, "You're thinking about Miss Grey, aren't you? She's hiding something." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. "She's frightened, Inspector, and frightened people often act against their better judgment. But I wonder if Mr. Hawthorne's burden is heavier than he lets on. A man so devoted to his coins might do anything to protect them or to reclaim them." She left the manor as dusk settled, the village bathed in a soft violet haze. Back at her cottage, she resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like a metronome as her mind sifted through the day's revelations. Hawthorne's burden was not just the loss of his coins, but the weight of his choices, his refusal to sell, his secret meeting, his strained finances. Somewhere in that burden, Miss Marple knew, lay a clue to the theft, and she was determined to find it, stitch by careful stitch, in the quiet heart of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 7. The Thief in the Night. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill that hinted at winter's approach, the village settling into a quiet hush as lights flickered on in cottage windows. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor fire, the glow casting soft shadows across her knitting, which lay untouched in her lap. Her thoughts were consumed by the theft at Hawthorne Manor, each clue a knot to be unraveled. The shadow seen by Lily, the disturbed earth beneath the study window, and the village's whispers of a stranger had woven themselves into her mind, forming a pattern that pointed to an elusive figure, the thief in the night. She knew that such a figure, real or imagined, often served as a convenient scapegoat, but she also knew that truth could hide in the most fleeting glimpses. Determined to pursue this thread, she resolved to visit the village pub, where gossip flowed as freely as ale, and where a stranger's presence would not have gone unnoticed. The following morning, Miss Marple set out for the Blue Boar, the village's sole public house, its low beams and smoky air a hub of local lore. The sky was overcast, the clouds heavy with the promise of more rain, and she clutched her umbrella as she walked, her steps brisk despite her age. The pub was quiet at this hour, save for a few early patrons nursing their pints. Tom, the barman, a stout man with a ruddy face and a knack for remembering faces, greeted her with a nod. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, wiping a glass with a cloth. "Not often we see you here. Come about the theft, I reckon." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling with their usual warmth. "You're very perceptive, Tom," she said, settling onto a stool at the bar. "I've heard talk of a stranger in the village the night Mr. Hawthorne's coins were taken. I thought you might have seen someone. Your memory is so reliable." Tom grinned, flattered by her words. "Aye, there was a fellow," he said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Came in that evening, round 8 or so. Dark coat, hat pulled low, not the sort to chat. Ordered a whiskey, paid in cash, and asked a question or two about the manor. Nothing direct, mind, just if it was far and who lived there. I thought he was just passing through, but he left quick, before 10, and I didn't see him after." He paused, then added, "Had a sharp look about him, like he was sizing things up." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained serene. "How interesting," she said. "And did he give a name, or say where he was staying?" Tom shook his head. "Not a word. Paid and left, like I said. But old Mr. Potts, the groundskeeper, was in later. Said he saw someone near the manor's gates around 10. Reckon it was the same man." Thanking him, Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with Mr. Potts herself. The stranger's presence, so neatly aligned with the theft's timeline, was intriguing, but she was wary of its convenience. A true outsider would need knowledge of the manor's layout, the safe's location, and the coin's value. Details not easily gleaned from a casual question at the pub. She left the Blue Boar and headed toward the manor, where she hoped to find Mr. Potts tending the gardens. The manor's grounds were a patchwork of autumn hues, the yew hedges dark against the fading roses. Mr. Potts, a wiry man with a face weathered by years outdoors, was raking leaves near the gate. He tipped his cap at Miss Marple's approach, his eyes curious but guarded. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Heard you're helping with this coin business. Nasty affair." "Indeed it is, Mr. Potts," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle. "I understand you saw someone near the gates the night of the theft. Can you tell me more?" Potts leaned on his rake, his brow furrowing. Was about 10, maybe a bit later. I was checking the sheds, making sure all was locked. Saw a figure by the gate, moving quick-like, keeping to the shadows. Couldn't see his face. Too dark, and he had a coat and hat, like Tom said. Thought he was just a passerby, but now I'm not so sure. He hesitated, then added, "Didn't look like he was lost, if you take my meaning." Knew where he was going. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. "And did you see him approach the house, or perhaps the garden near the study?" Potts shook his head. "Lost sight of him once he passed the gate, but the garden path runs close to the study window, and it's hidden from the road. If someone wanted to sneak in, that'd be the way." Thanking him, Miss Marple walked the path herself, her eyes scanning the ground. The earth was still soft from recent rain, but any footprints had been blurred by the groundskeeper's raking or the weather's touch. She paused beneath the study window, noting its height, 6 feet from the ground, as Mrs. Hawthorne had said, but not impossible to reach with a step or a boost. The latch, she recalled, bore a tiny nick, suggesting a tool had been used to slip it open. A professional thief, perhaps, but one with specific knowledge of the manor's vulnerabilities. Returning to the village, Miss Marple stopped at the post office, where Mrs. Clegg was sorting letters behind the counter. "Good day, Mrs. Clegg," she said, purchasing another unnecessary stamp. "I wonder if you've had any other visitors sending parcels recently, perhaps someone new to the village?" Mrs. Clegg's eyes gleamed with the delight of sharing news. "Not many, Miss Marple, but there was a man the day after the theft. Come to think of it, didn't give a name, paid in cash for a small package to London. Looked like he didn't want to be noticed, kept his head down, wore a dark coat. I thought it odd, but we get all sorts passing through." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained calm. "And this package, was it heavy, like Mr. Vane's?" "Not as heavy," Mrs. Clegg said, "but solid-like. Could have been coins, I suppose, but I didn't ask. He was gone before I could blink." Thanking her, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind abuzz with the stranger's shadow. The man at the pub, the figure at the gate, the parcel at the post office, all pointed to an outsider, yet the precision of the theft suggested an insider's knowledge. She thought of Mr. Vane's parcel, sent to a London dealer, and Mr. Hawthorne's meeting with Felix Drayton, a name now linked to both. Could the stranger be a hired hand, acting on someone's instructions? Or was he a fiction, conjured to divert suspicion? That afternoon, Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Craddock, who arrived with a weary air, his notebook bulging with notes. "We've traced the stranger's description to a man seen at the railway station," he said, settling into her parlor. "No name, but he took a late train to London the night of the theft. We're checking with the station master for more details. But I'll be honest, Miss Marple, this feels too neat. A stranger who vanishes without a trace?" Miss Marple nodded, offering him a cup of tea. "I quite agree, Inspector. A thief in the night is a compelling story, but stories are often told to hide the truth. Have you looked into Mr. Drayton, the dealer Mr. Hawthorne met?" Craddock's eyes narrowed. "We have. He's known in certain circles, deals in rare coins, but there's talk he's not above handling stolen goods. We're sending a man to his shop tomorrow to ask questions." Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, her mind weaving a pattern. The stranger, if real, was a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole. She thought of Sylvia's muddy shoes, Vane's parcel, and Hawthorne's financial strain, each a thread tied to the theft, and perhaps to the shadowy figure who had slipped through the village like a ghost. As Craddock left, promising to keep her informed, she settled back in her chair, her eyes on the fire. The thief in the night might be a phantom, but in St. Mary Mead, phantoms had a way of revealing their faces, and Miss Marple was determined to see this one clearly. Chapter 8. The Web Tightens. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a silvery veil that softened the outlines of its cottages and hedgerows. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of tea and a slice of toast, gazed out her window, her thoughts as intricate as the lace curtains framing her view. The theft of Mr. Hawthorne's coin collection had woven a complex web, its strands connecting the nervous Miss Sylvia Gray, the calculating Mr. Clarence Vane, the burdened Mr. Hawthorne, and the elusive stranger who haunted the village's whispers. Each clue, Sylvia's muddy shoes, Vane's parcel to London, Hawthorne's meeting with Felix Drayton, and the shadow by the study window, formed a pattern that Miss Marple was beginning to discern, though its full shape remained tantalizingly out of reach. An invitation to tea at Hawthorne Manor, delivered by the postman with a knowing smile, offered a chance to tighten the web. Mrs. Hawthorne's note was polite but urgent, hinting at her hope that Miss Marple's presence might calm the household's fraying nerves. Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity to observe the suspects together, donned her gray coat and a hat adorned with a single feather, its simplicity belying her sharp intent. The manor, as she approached, seemed to loom larger under the mist, its windows glinting like watchful eyes. The drawing-room was warm, the fire crackling with a vigor that contrasted with the subdued mood of its occupants. Mrs. Hawthorne, her hands smoothing her skirt with practiced calm, greeted Miss Marple with a strained smile. "You're so good to come, Miss Marple," she said, pouring tea with a steadiness that belied her anxious eyes. "This dreadful business has us all on edge." Mr. Hawthorne sat by the fire, his face etched with lines of worry, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the armrest. Miss Sylvia Gray, perched on a sofa, her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles gleamed white, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. Mr. Clarence Vane occupied an armchair, his lean frame angled forward, his sharp gaze flitting from face to face like a hawk assessing its prey. Inspector Craddock had sent word he would be delayed, leaving Miss Marple to steer the conversation, her gentle demeanor a mask for her probing mind. "I do hope the inspector has news soon," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup of tea, her voice soft but carrying. "It's so unsettling to think of those coins lost to the world. Such treasures deserve to be cherished, don't they, Mr. Vane?" Her eyes met his, mild but searching, inviting him to speak. Vane's smile was tight, his fingers rubbing together in that familiar gesture. "Absolutely, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as polished silver. "The collection is a masterpiece, Roman ori, medieval pennies, a Stuart shilling so fine it could grace a museum. To think of them in the wrong hands." He shook his head, his expression one of calculated dismay, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes lingered on her, as if gauging her intent. Sylvia stirred, her voice high and unsteady. "It's awful, isn't it? To think someone could be so cruel, stealing something so precious." Her words were fervent, but her gaze flickered to Vane, a fleeting look that carried a weight Miss Marple could not yet name. Fear, perhaps, or complicity. Mr. Hawthorne's hand stilled on the armrest, his voice low but sharp. "It's not just cruelty, it's betrayal. Someone knew the safe, knew the house. I can't believe it was a stranger, not entirely." His eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, met Miss Marple's, and she saw in them a flicker of doubt, as if he questioned his own trust in those closest to him. Mrs. Hawthorne, setting down the teapot, nodded briskly. "Reginald's right. It feels personal, like someone meant to wound us. But who? We've been nothing but kind to our guests." Her words were a defense, but Miss Marple caught the glance she cast toward Sylvia, a mix of affection and suspicion. Seizing the moment, Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone conversational. "The black market, Mr. Vane. You mentioned it before. It's such a shadowy world, isn't it? I imagine it takes someone with great knowledge to navigate it, someone who knows exactly what such coins are worth." Her words were gentle, but she watched Vane closely, noting the sudden stillness in his posture, the way his fingers paused mid-rub. "It does," he said, his voice measured. "The black market thrives on expertise. A dealer like Felix Drayton, for instance. He'd know how to place such coins discreetly. Not that I'm suggesting he's involved, of course." His smile was quick, but Miss Marple caught the tension in it, the way his eyes darted to Sylvia, who looked away, her face paling. Sylvia's reaction was not lost on Miss Marple, who turned to her with a kind smile. "You must feel so out of place in all this, Miss Grey," she said. "A guest caught in such a storm. Did you know much about the coins before that evening? They must have been a sight." Sylvia's hands twisted in her lap, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know much, no. They were beautiful, but I'm not an expert like Mr. Vane. I just admired them." Her eyes flicked to the door again, and Miss Marple wondered what, or who, she feared might enter. The conversation drifted to village matters, but Miss Marple steered it back, her voice soft but persistent. "It's curious, isn't it? How the thief knew exactly when to strike. The study window, left ajar, was so convenient, almost as if someone ensured it was open." She paused, her eyes resting on each face in turn, noting Vane's slight frown, Sylvia's quick intake of breath, and Hawthorne's clenched jaw. Mrs. Hawthorne broke the silence, her tone sharp. "The window was Lily's mistake, surely. She's young, forgetful. No one in this house would aid a thief." Her defense was fierce, but Miss Marple sensed a crack in her certainty, a fear that the betrayal came from within. As the tea ended, Miss Marple excused herself to the study, citing a wish to see the room again. Mrs. Hawthorne, eager to please, accompanied her, leaving the others to linger in the drawing room. The study was as she remembered: oak shelves, mahogany desk, the portrait swung aside to reveal the empty safe. Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the window, its latch gleaming in the dim light. She approached it, her fingers brushing the frame, where the faint nick she had noticed before seemed slightly deeper, as if worked at repeatedly. "A clever trick," she murmured, almost to herself. "A thin blade could slip this latch, couldn't it?" Mrs. Hawthorne frowned, her hands smoothing her skirt. "I suppose so, but who would know to try? It's not common knowledge, surely." Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "People talk, Mrs. Hawthorne, even when they don't mean to, and knowledge has a way of spreading, like ripples in a pond." Her words were vague, but her mind was sharp, connecting the latch to the stranger's shadow, to Sylvia's muddy shoes, to Vane's parcel. Returning to the village, Miss Marple stopped at the church, where the vicar's wife, Mrs. Price, was arranging hymnals. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Price. she said, her voice warm. "I hear there's been talk of a stranger in the village. Have you heard anything?" Mrs. Price, ever eager for news, nodded. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. My maid saw a man near the manor 2 nights before the theft, loitering by the lane. Dark coat," she said, "and he seemed to be watching the house. She thought he was lost, but he hurried off when she called out." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind adding this to the web. A stranger watching the manor days before suggested planning, but planning required information. Information only someone close to the coins could provide. Back at her cottage, she settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a metronome. The web was tightening, she knew, its strands drawing Vane, Sylvia, and the shadowy stranger closer together. She thought of Vane's guarded expertise, Sylvia's fear, and the name Felix Drayton, a dealer who bridged their worlds. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's thoughts wove on, certain that the truth, like a spider's prey, was caught in the delicate strands she was patiently spinning. Chapter 9. The London Connection. The soft patter of rain had returned to St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a gentle drizzle that mirrored the quiet unease settling over its residents. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cozy parlor, watched the droplets trace paths down her window, her knitting needles resting in her lap as her mind wove through the intricate puzzle of the Hawthorne theft. The web she had sensed tightening yesterday, its strands linking Mr. Clarence Vane's parcel, Miss Sylvia Gray's nervousness, Mr. Hawthorne's financial strain, and the shadowy stranger, had begun to converge on a single name: Felix Drayton, the London dealer whose interest in the coins seemed more than academic. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door, and Lily, her maid, announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, his coat damp and his expression one of suppressed excitement. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Craddock said, shaking the rain from his hat as he stepped inside. "I hope I'm not intruding, but we've had a breakthrough, and I thought you'd want to know." His tone carried the cautious optimism of a man who valued her insight, and Miss Marple, gesturing to a chair, offered him tea with her usual warmth. "Not at all, Inspector," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I'm all ears. What have you found?" Craddock settled into the chair, his notebook open on his knee. "We traced Mr. Vane's parcel, the one sent to London the day after the theft. It was delivered to Felix Drayton's shop in Mayfair, just as you suspected. We obtained a warrant and searched the premises yesterday. Inside the parcel were 5 coins, part of Hawthorne's collection, including the Charles I shilling and a Roman denarius. Drayton claimed he received them from an anonymous seller, but he's being cagey about details." Miss Marple's needles remained still, her mind racing. "How very interesting," she said, her voice soft but alert. "And Mr. Vane, what does he say about this?" Craddock's frown deepened. "He's sticking to a story. Says he was sent the coins by a client who wished to remain anonymous, asked him to verify their authenticity before passing them to Drayton for appraisal. He claims he had no idea they were stolen. But there's more. We checked his bank records, and there's a deposit of £2,000 made the day after the parcel was sent, far more than his usual fees." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly, though her expression remained serene. "A substantial sum," she murmured. "And Mr. Drayton, does he have a history of dealing in questionable goods?" Craddock nodded. "He's known to skirt the edges of legality, sells to private collectors, some of whom don't ask where their acquisitions come from. We're holding him for questioning, but he's not talking yet. I've a feeling he knows more than he's letting on." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to the web's tightening strands. Vane's parcel, linked to Drayton, confirmed her suspicion that the appraiser's role was more than peripheral. But Sylvia Gray's nervousness, her muddy shoes, and her inquiry about London trains suggested she, too, was entangled, perhaps unwillingly. And Mr. Hawthorne's meeting with Drayton, however innocent, he claimed, hinted at a connection that could not be ignored. "Have you spoken to Miss Gray again, Inspector?" she asked, her tone casual. "She seems so unsettled, poor thing." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "I have. She's sticking to her story. Reading in her room, heard nothing, but she's jittery. When I mentioned Drayton's name, she went pale, though she denied knowing him. I'm keeping her at the manor for now, under watch." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. "And Mr. Hawthorne, has he shed any light on his meeting with Drayton?" "He's adamant it was just business," Craddock said. "Says he refused to sell, but admitted Drayton pressed him hard, even asked about the safe's security. We're checking Drayton's contacts to see if he's linked to our stranger, the man seen at the pub and the manor gates." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her face remained placid. "A stranger is so convenient, isn't he, Inspector? But I wonder if our thief is closer than we think. A connection to London, to Drayton, suggests someone with knowledge and motive." She paused, then added, "Might I suggest looking into Miss Gray's movements before she arrived at the manor? A young woman in distress often has a history that explains her fears." Craddock jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. "Good point. We'll check her background, any ties to London or Drayton. You've a knack for this, Miss Marple." She smiled, her hands folding over her knitting bag. "I only see what people show, Inspector, and people, you know, are rarely as careful as they think." After Craddock left, Miss Marple decided to visit the village stationer, Mr. Ellis, whose shop was a hub of local chatter. The drizzle had eased, leaving the air fresh and the cobblestones slick under her sensible shoes. Mr. Ellis, a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, what brings you out in this weather? Not more about those coins, I hope?" "Oh, just a small errand," she said, selecting a packet of notepaper. "But I do hear such interesting things. Tell me, has Miss Gray been in recently? I thought I saw her here, perhaps sending a letter." Mr. Ellis nodded, his eyes bright with gossip. "She was, day before last. Bought a stamp and sent a letter to London. Urgent, she said, though. She didn't say to who. Looked proper nervous, kept glancing out the window like she was expecting someone." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind adding this to the pattern. A letter to London, sent after the theft, suggested Sylvia was communicating with someone, perhaps Drayton, or someone connected to Vane. Returning to the manor for an impromptu visit, she found Mrs. Hawthorne in the garden, pruning roses despite the damp. "Miss Marple, what a surprise," Mrs. Hawthorne said, her gloves streaked with earth. "I'm trying to keep busy, you know. This whole affair is so upsetting." "I can imagine," Miss Marple said, her voice sympathetic. "I was just thinking of Miss Gray. She seems so delicate, doesn't she? Has she mentioned any plans to return to London?" Mrs. Hawthorne's pruning shears paused, her expression tightening. "She did, actually, yesterday. Said she might need to leave soon, something about a family matter. I told her she's welcome to stay, but she's been so restless. I wonder if the theft has upset her more than she lets on." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to Sylvia's fear, her letter, her muddy shoes. "It's a trying time for everyone," she said, "but I'm sure the inspector will sort it out." She left the manor, her mind buzzing with the London connection. Sylvia's letter, Vane's parcel, Drayton's shop, all pointed to a network beyond St. Mary Mead, one that had ensnared the coins and, perhaps, the suspects themselves. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a metronome. The web was tighter now, its strands converging on Drayton's shop where the coins had surfaced. Vane's deposit suggested greed, Sylvia's letter hinted at desperation, and Hawthorne's meeting with Drayton raised questions of trust. The stranger, she suspected, was a distraction, a shadow cast to obscure the real culprits. As the rain resumed its soft patter, Miss Marple's thoughts wove on, certain that the truth, like a hidden stitch, was waiting to be uncovered in the quiet heart of the village. Chapter 10. The Truth Unraveled. The soft gray light of a late October morning filtered through the windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting gentle glow across her parlor. She sat in her armchair, a cup of tea cooling beside her, her knitting needles silent as her mind wove the final threads of the Hawthorne theft. The web she had been patiently spinning, connecting Mr. Clarence Vane's parcel, Miss Sylvia Gray's nervous demeanor, Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's financial strain, and the shadowy stranger, had tightened around Felix Drayton's London shop, where stolen coins had surfaced. Yet the precise roles of the suspects remained elusive, like a pattern half seen in the mist. Miss Marple knew the truth was close, and when Mrs. Hawthorne telephoned to request her presence at the manor for a gathering with Inspector Craddock, she sensed the moment had come to unravel the mystery. The manor's drawing room was a study in tension, its warm fire doing little to dispel the chill of suspicion that hung over the assembled company. Mrs. Hawthorne, her composure fraying at the edges, poured tea with hands that trembled slightly. Mr. Hawthorne stood by the mantel, his face gaunt, his eyes fixed on the floor as if it held answers to his loss. Miss Sylvia Gray sat on a sofa, her delicate frame hunched, her fingers twisting a handkerchief until it seemed it might tear. Mr. Clarence Vane occupied an armchair, his lean figure poised, his sharp eyes darting from face to face, betraying a wariness Miss Marple noted with interest. Inspector Craddock stood near the door, his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression one of quiet determination. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, though she made no move to open it. "Such a trying time for you all," she said, her voice gentle but carrying. "But I believe we're close to understanding what happened to those coins. Don't you think so, Inspector?" Craddock nodded, his gaze sweeping the room. "We've made progress," he said. "The coins found in Mr. Drayton's shop are a start, and we've uncovered connections that point to the truth. But I'd like to hear Miss Marple's thoughts. She has a way of seeing what we miss." All eyes turned to her, and Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene, but her mind as sharp as her needles. "It's a curious thing," she began, her voice soft, "how people reveal themselves, even when they mean to hide. This theft, I think, was not the work of a stranger, but of someone who knew the manor well, someone who saw an opportunity and took it." She paused, letting her words settle, noting the way Vane's fingers stilled, Sylvia's breath caught, and Hawthorne's jaw tightened. "The study window," she continued, "was the key. Left ajar, perhaps by accident, but more likely by design. A thin blade could slip the latch, as I noticed from the nick in the frame. Someone entered that night, someone who knew the safe's location and the coin's value. But who? Her eyes rested on Vane, whose smile was fixed, almost brittle. "Mr. Vane," she said, her tone conversational. "Your expertise was invaluable to Mr. Hawthorne. You knew every coin in that collection, its history, its worth, its allure to collectors like Mr. Drayton. When you appraised the coins last week, you saw not just their beauty, but their potential. A parcel sent to Drayton's shop, containing 5 of those coins, was traced to you, and a deposit of £2,000, far beyond your usual fees, appeared in your account soon after." Vane's face paled, but his voice was steady. "I've explained that, Miss Marple. I received those coins from a client to verify their authenticity. I had no idea they were stolen. As for the money, it was payment for other work, perfectly legitimate." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes kind but unrelenting. "Perhaps, but the timing is curious, isn't it? And the parcel, sent so urgently the day after the theft, suggests a haste that's hard to ignore. You visited the manor that evening, saw the coins, and knew the window's vulnerability. A man of your knowledge could slip a latch, could he not?" Vane's hands clenched, but before he could respond, Miss Marple turned to Sylvia, whose eyes were wide with fear. "And you, Miss Grey," she said gently, "you've been so troubled. Your shoes caked with mud from the garden path, and your coat damp that night, suggest you were outside, perhaps near the study window. You told us you were reading, but your nervousness, your letter to London, your questions about trains, they tell a different story." Sylvia's handkerchief tore, a soft rip that echoed in the silent room. I wasn't," she stammered, her voice breaking. "I didn't steal anything." "I believe you," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "But you saw something, didn't you? Or did something, perhaps under pressure. You're in debt, I suspect, to someone who used that against you." Her eyes flicked to Vane, whose face had hardened. Mrs. Hawthorne gasped, her teacup rattling in its saucer. "Sylvia? Surely not. She's family, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Family can be persuaded, Mrs. Hawthorne, especially when desperate. I think Mr. Vane persuaded Miss Grey to help, perhaps to ensure the window was open, to act as a lookout. She didn't enter the study, but she played a part, however small." Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, her voice a whisper. "I didn't want to," she said, her words tumbling out. "Clarence, Mr. Vane, he knew about my debts from a gambling house in London. He said if I helped, he'd settle them. I only left the window unlatched, I swear. I stood in the garden, watching, but I didn't take the coins." Vane stood abruptly, his voice sharp. "This is nonsense. You've no proof, Miss Marple. I'm an appraiser, not a thief." Craddock stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "We have the parcel, Mr. Vane, and the coins in Drayton's shop. We've also traced your correspondence with Drayton. Letters arranging a sale, dated before the theft. You planned this, didn't you? Used Miss Grey's debt to ensure her help, slipped the latch, took the coins, and sent them to Drayton for the black market." Vane's composure cracked, his eyes darting to the door. "You can't prove intent," he said, but his voice wavered, and Miss Marple saw the resignation in his posture. Hawthorne, silent until now, rose, his face a mask of fury. "You betrayed my trust, Vane. Those coins were my life." His voice broke, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy, though she noted his hands, clenched not just in anger, but in relief, as if a weight had lifted. "Miss Marple's voice cut through the tension, soft but clear. It was greed, Mr. Vane, that undid you. You saw the coin's value, knew Drayton's network, and thought you could vanish with a fortune. But St. Mary Mead is a small place, and secrets don't stay hidden long, not from those who watch closely. Vane slumped back into his chair, his bravado gone. I needed the money, he muttered. Drayton promised a buyer, no questions asked. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Sylvia sobbed, her face buried in her hands, and Mrs. Hawthorne moved to comfort her, though her expression was one of shocked betrayal. Craddock signaled to an officer waiting outside, who entered to escort Vane away. "We'll need a full statement, Miss Gray," he said, his tone gentler. "Your cooperation will help." As the room emptied, Miss Marple remained, her eyes on the fire. The truth, as she had known, lay in the small things: muddy shoes, a nicked latch, a hasty parcel. The stranger, she suspected, was a fiction, a story Vane had spread to divert suspicion, though Craddock would confirm it. She rose, thanking Mrs. Hawthorne, and stepped into the rain, her mind already turning to the coins still lost, and the quiet village that had, once again, revealed its hidden depths. Chapter 11. The coins restored. The rain had ceased in St. Mary Mead, leaving the village air crisp and clean, with a faint scent of damp earth lingering as the sun broke through the clouds. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles moving steadily, the soft click of their rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. The unraveling of the Hawthorne theft had brought clarity, with Mr. Clarence Vane's confession and Miss Sylvia Gray's tearful admission painting a vivid picture of greed and coercion. Yet the recovery of the stolen coins remained incomplete, and Miss Marple's mind lingered on the pieces still lost to Felix Drayton's shadowy network. The village, though relieved by the truth, buzzed with a quiet anticipation, waiting for the final threads of the mystery to be tied. A telephone call from Inspector Craddock that morning confirmed her presence was needed at the manor, where he planned to update the Hawthornes on the investigation's progress. Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity to see the aftermath of the revelations, donned her familiar tweed coat and set out, her umbrella tucked under her arm as a precaution against the capricious autumn weather. The manor stood bathed in sunlight, its Georgian facade serene, though Miss Marple knew the calm was fragile, built on the ruins of trust betrayed. The drawing room, where she was ushered by a subdued James, the footman, was quieter than before, the absence of Vane and Sylvia casting a somber note. Mrs. Evelyn Hawthorne greeted her with a weary smile, her hands clasped tightly as she offered tea. Mr. Reginald Hawthorne sat by the window, his posture less rigid than in days past, though his eyes still carried the weight of loss. Inspector Craddock stood near the fireplace, his notebook closed, his expression one of cautious satisfaction. The air held a sense of resolution, but Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of unresolved questions, like a melody half played. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," Craddock said, his voice warm with respect. "Your insights were invaluable. As always, we've made significant progress, and I thought you'd like to hear the outcome." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, though she made no move to open it. "I'm delighted to hear it, Inspector," she said, her tone gentle but alert. "Have you recovered more of Mr. Hawthorne's coins?" Craddock nodded, his eyes flicking to Hawthorne, who leaned forward, hope flickering in his gaze. "We raided Drayton's shop again, based on Vane's confession," Craddock said. Found another 12 coins hidden in a false compartment beneath his desk, most of the collection, including the Trajan Aureus and the Edward III Groat. Drayton's been arrested, charged with receiving stolen goods, and he's talking now, hoping for leniency. He's named a few buyers, but some coins, 5 or 6, are still unaccounted for, likely sold on the black market. Hawthorne's hands clenched, his voice low but steady. 12 back is more than I dared hope, he said. Those coins, they're my life's work. To know they're safe again, it's a relief, though the loss of the rest stings. His eyes met Miss Marple's, and she saw gratitude mingled with lingering pain. Mrs. Hawthorne, pouring tea, added, "It's a miracle, really, thanks to you, Miss Marple, and the inspector. But what of Sylvia? I can't believe she was involved, even if coerced." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind remained sharp. "Miss Grey was in a difficult position, Mrs. Hawthorne," she said. "Debt can make people do desperate things, especially when someone like Mr. Vane knows how to exploit it. I believe she's truly sorry, and her cooperation has helped, hasn't it, Inspector?" Craddock nodded. "She's given a full statement, detailing how Vane pressured her. He knew of her debts from a London gambling house, debts she'd kept from you, Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne. She agreed to leave the study window unlatched and act as lookout, but she didn't enter the study or handle the coins. We're recommending leniency, given her remorse and assistance." Mrs. Hawthorne's face softened, though her voice held a note of betrayal. "She should have told us. We'd have helped her. But to think she let that man manipulate her." She trailed off, shaking her head. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to the missing coins. "It's a pity about those last few," she said, her tone thoughtful. "The black market is a shadowy place, isn't it? But I wonder, Inspector, have you checked Drayton's other contacts? A man like that must have associates who move quickly." Craddock's eyes narrowed, a spark of interest in his gaze. "We're on it, Miss Marple. Drayton's given us names, 2 dealers in Paris and 1 in Amsterdam. We've alerted Interpol, but it's a long shot. Those coins could be anywhere by now." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her mind busy. "And the stranger we heard so much about, the man at the pub, the figure at the gate, was he real, or a story to divert us?" Craddock smiled faintly, a rare glimpse of amusement. "A story, it seems. Vane admitted to spreading the rumor through a contact at the pub, hoping to throw us off. The man seen by Potts and others was likely Vane himself, scouting the manor earlier that week. He wore a dark coat to blend in, knowing the village would talk." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How clever of him," she said, "and how careless. People in St. Mary Mead notice everything, don't they? A stranger is too tempting a tale to ignore." Hawthorne stirred, his voice softer now. "I trusted Vane," he said. "His knowledge, his passion for coins, it was like mine. To think he used it against me." He paused, then added, "I've learned my lesson, Miss Marple. The safe will have a new combination, and I'll install an alarm. No one will get near those coins again." Mrs. Hawthorne reached for his hand, her face a mix of relief and resolve. "We'll rebuild, Reginald. The coins we have back are a start, and we'll manage the rest." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the strain in her eyes, the toll of a household shaken by betrayal. As the conversation wound down, Miss Marple rose, thanking her hosts with her usual courtesy. "You've been through a great ordeal," she said, "but I'm heartened to know most of your treasures are safe. I do hope the rest are found soon." Her words were sincere, but her mind lingered on Sylvia, whose absence from the manor suggested a departure, perhaps to face her debts or to escape the village's judgment. Outside, the sun warmed the gravel drive, and Miss Marple walked slowly, her thoughts on the coins still lost. She stopped at the post office where Mrs. Clegg was sorting letters, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Miss Marple, I hear they've caught the thief," she said, leaning over the counter. "Is it true Miss Gray's gone?" Miss Marple nodded, selecting a postcard she didn't need. "She's left, I believe." Mrs. Clegg: "A sad business, but she did help the police in the end. Have you heard anything new about those parcels to London?" Mrs. Clegg shook her head. "Nothing since that man Vane sent his. But I'll keep my ears open, Miss Marple. You never know what folks let slip." Thanking her, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, the village settling into its evening calm. She settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a metronome. The coins restored were a victory, but the few still missing nagged at her, a loose stitch in an otherwise tidy pattern. Vane's greed, Sylvia's desperation, Drayton's duplicity. All had been laid bare, but the black market's reach was long, and Miss Marple knew some secrets might remain buried. As the fire crackled, she smiled faintly, content that St. Mary Mead, for now, had reclaimed its peace, and that her quiet observations had once again brought light to its shadows. Chapter 12. A Quiet Village. The autumn sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a golden light that softened the edges of its thatched roofs and stone walls. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke, a reminder that winter was not far off. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, the soft click a counterpoint to the stillness that had settled over the village. The theft at Hawthorne Manor, with its web of greed, desperation, and betrayal, had been unraveled, and the village had returned to its quiet routine, though the echoes of the scandal lingered in whispered conversations at the post office and the Blue Boar. Most of Mr. Reginald Hawthorne's rare coin collection had been recovered, Clarence Vane was awaiting trial, and Sylvia Gray had left St. Mary Mead, her reputation tarnished, but her cooperation with the police earning her a measure of leniency. Yet Miss Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human nature, knew that peace in a village like hers was often a fragile thing, a surface calm that concealed deeper currents. The morning brought a visit from Mrs. Evelyn Hawthorne, who arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with a basket of apples from the manor's orchard, a gesture of gratitude wrapped in her usual practical warmth. "Miss Marple, I can't thank you enough," she said, settling into a chair as Miss Marple poured tea. "You and Inspector Craddock have given us back our peace of mind. Reginald is sleeping again, and the coins, well, most of them, are safe." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her mild expression. "I'm glad to hear it, Mrs. Hawthorne," she said, passing a cup. "It was a trying ordeal for you all. How is Mr. Hawthorne managing now that the dust has settled?" Mrs. Hawthorne sighed, her hands smoothing the edge of her scarf. "Better, though he's still shaken. Losing even a few coins to that dreadful black market has wounded him, but he's determined to protect what's left. He's had a new safe installed, with all sorts of modern alarms. No one will get near those coins again." Her voice held a note of pride, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of worry in her eyes as if the betrayal of trust lingered like a bruise. "And Miss Gray?" Miss Marple asked gently, her needles pausing. "I heard she's returned to London." Mrs. Hawthorne nodded, her expression a mix of sorrow and resignation. "She left yesterday, quietly. I think she was ashamed. Poor girl. She wrote us a letter, apologizing for her part, saying she'd never meant to hurt us. I wish she'd told us about her debts. We'd have helped her, you know. But Vane?" She trailed off, her lips tightening at the name. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to Sylvia's tearful confession, coerced by Vane's knowledge of her gambling debts. "It's a sad thing when someone's weakness is used against them," she said. "But she did the right thing in the end, helping the police. I hope she finds her way." Mrs. Hawthorne sipped her tea, her face softening. "I hope so, too. She's young, and London's a hard place. Perhaps this will be a lesson." She paused, then added, "Inspector Craddock says they're still searching for the last few coins. Do you think they'll ever find them?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the window, where the village lay serene under the autumn sun. "The black market is a shadowy world, Mrs. Hawthorne," she said. "Those coins may be in Paris or Amsterdam by now, in the hands of collectors who ask no questions. But sometimes, even shadows give up their secrets. I wouldn't lose hope." Mrs. Hawthorne smiled, a touch of her old vigor returning. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. The village doesn't know how lucky it is to have you." Miss Marple waved a hand, her smile modest. "Oh, I'm just an old woman who notices things, Mrs. Hawthorne. People are much the same everywhere, you know. Greed, fear, loyalty, they show themselves in the smallest ways." After Mrs. Hawthorne left, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, her steps slow but deliberate, her eyes taking in the familiar sights. The butcher's shop, where the boy was sweeping the step. The post office, where Mrs. Clegg was gossiping with a customer. The church, where the vicar's wife was tending the flower beds. The theft had stirred St. Mary Mead, but its rhythm was restored, its secrets once again tucked beneath its quiet surface. Yet Miss Marple knew that vigilance was never wasted, for villages, like people, held their truths close. At the Blue Boar, she paused to exchange pleasantries with Tom, the barman, who was polishing glasses with his usual cheer. "Heard they got most of those coins back, Miss Marple," he said, leaning across the bar. "Thanks to you, I reckon. Any word on that stranger we all talked about?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A story, it seems, Tom," she said. "Mr. Vane was clever, but not clever enough. The village sees more than people think." Tom grinned, nodding. "Aye, and you see more than most. Reckon we'll have a quiet winter now?" "I hope so," she said, though her smile held a hint of skepticism. "But one never knows, does one?" Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a heartbeat. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow across the room, and she thought of the coins, most restored, a few lost forever, like secrets swallowed by time. Vane's greed, Sylvia's desperation, Drayton's duplicity. All had been laid bare, but the village itself remained unchanged, its quiet surface hiding the complexities of human nature. As she knitted, Miss Marple's mind wandered to other mysteries, other shadows, knowing that in St. Mary Mead, peace was a gift to be cherished, but never taken for granted.